So welcome, Lara Land, to Keen on Yoga. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Adam. Very excited.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. We were just discussing that although we've both spent a long time in Mysore, we never actually crossed paths. So it's nice to speak to you at last. Obviously, I've worked with you online, but never met you in person. And primarily the work that you're doing online now, a lot of it is to do with trauma therapy and yoga. So today, principally, we'd like to have a little chat together about trauma and how trauma turns up in yoga. And so the obvious place to start, I suppose, like to try and get into this conversation is, well, what in relation to yoga, how does it manifest? What are we looking for? What does it mean?
Yeah.
When we talk about trauma in yoga. Yeah.
A lot to unpack there. So I try to kind of, I think we're all, first of all, I just want to say that I think we're all feeling a little bit like we've been through a trauma after the last years. And I think, many of us have, and not all trauma is the same. And so, different people, in fact, the same incident will impact different people differently based on a whole slew of factors, like their previous history, what they're able to do, at the moment of the traumatic event or moments. For instance, like, are you able to act in any way? Because trauma is basically about losing our agency, our autonomy. So in that moment, or in those many moments, we're overwhelmed by a situation, and we can't get out of it. So the body does a whole bunch of things to protect the mind, body, spirit system, right? It is brilliant, what our system does to protect us. But it can harm us long term when the impacts of the trauma stay with us and the body doesn't know I'm safe now. And maybe it isn't safe. So like I said, lots to unpack. When we think about trauma, usually we think about like a single event, maybe an assault, maybe an accident. But many events can leave us traumatized. There's complex trauma, which is ongoing, usually in childhood. There's witnessing. If you witness a traumatic event, and as you're witnessing, you can't get away, you can't stop it, you can't help that person. That can be traumatizing.
So what I'm understanding is there's some kind of lack of resolution and experience that's necessary and relevant, I think, for first of all, so we're not blaming ourselves for that feeling because the body was doing something very appropriate and relevant. But yeah, there's something that remains an experience that then kind of remains unresolved, at least in the background, if not in the foreground, when that reaction is no longer appropriate to the current circumstances. Is that right? Yeah.
So, when we experience a trauma, there's a stress response in the body. We've all felt stress. So we can understand that, right? And so when the stress is overwhelming, either you've probably heard of fight or flight or freeze, right? So if we can't get away and we can't fight, we freeze, we shut down, and the body will disassociate. So you may experience being outside of the body, so not feeling what's happening. And then post-trauma, some people might stay quite disassociated. Some people might be inside their bodies and be hypervigilant. So every sound, super jumpy, and it can vacillate between the two.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So the obvious next question is, what relationship does yoga play to this, and the resolution of trauma in the body?
Yeah.
Because I'm assuming, we haven't really touched upon the fact that the trauma has to be somewhere, and it's probably, as someone like Bessel van der Kolk, who I interviewed on the podcast, it would say that it's the trauma is actually somewhere in the visceral tissue of the body, right?
Yeah, absolutely. agree. If it's not resolved, the trauma stays in the body. And so, if we have that, and that's the difference, right? When we said, like, some people are traumatized and some people maybe have resources that can get them through that event or those events where they're not traumatized, where they're able to let the body release what happened. Usually it's just described as a shaking. Peter Levine talks a lot about that in his somatic work. And, if you know what to do, if you have the right resources, the right therapies, I mean, there are a lot of ifs, but many of us hold, our stresses or our traumas inside, because we got to get back to life, right? Capitalism. And we got to, keep on chucking on, or we think that's the right thing to do, that we should hold it all together. And then maybe we come into yoga room and start breathing, those muscles start releasing, and some of that stored stress starts coming out. And then,
do you think there's anything specific about yoga? I often kind of feel like, is it particular to yoga, or would that happen? I mean, again, like with, when we read people like Peter Levine or Bessel's work, there's many people talking about trauma. They don't particularly emphasize yoga as a modality. It seems like any movement modality would inherently release or stir up those things that are otherwise kind of hidden within deep in the body, right? Any kind of movement, or is there something particular you thinking about the yoga, or even about, say, the modality of the self-practice Ashtanga yoga, even, that would do that more in your own experience, for example?
Well, anything can trigger a reaction. So, I mean, for someone who's been through a trauma, they could be just smell a perfume, right? Or see, anything could trigger a reaction or a release. But I think there's something very powerful about yoga, and particularly Ashtanga yoga, depending on how it's taught, though, like anything, the teacher and the circumstance is really gonna play a big part in this. And this is a lot of what I talk about in the book, are the things about Ashtanga yoga that are particularly helpful for trauma survivors. For instance, the repetition. If you're as a teacher, if you're working with someone who has had a trauma, you don't want to be throwing like a lot of different things at them. It's helpful to know like what to expect. What am I going to do when I walk in this room, right? Because remember, we talked about hypervigilance, so they might be just looking around, nervous, on edge.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
with our sequence,
you know what to expect. That really rings a bell with me, coming in, and you're not kind of thinking, well, what's it going to be today, which will make you a little bit, for some people already suffering with anxiety, that would make you a bit nervous, wouldn't it? Oh, is it going to be something that's too challenging, or I'll be unable to do that posture, so I feel like a sense of embarrassment or lack in front of the class, etc. And with this, you know what you're doing, and also with this self-practice style, you have an element of autonomy as well. So you're under control, so you're not giving your control away to another. And the one thing I'd add before turning over to you again is that there's something about repetition and ritual. If you think about someone has a trauma or something in the body, in indigenous cultures, there would have been some kind of ceremony or something for a sense of release, which would have involved a ritual, an invocation, Obviously we've lost these things in current, kind of culture, which is more rational and, brain kind of centered, but there's something about going through a particular kind of incantation every time to yourself that for me personally was cathartic, dealing with my own experiences.
And I want to be careful about, I don't think it's a replacement for other, therapy. And I think we want to be careful as teachers about like any kind of trying to get a release. out of a student because we think that like
Exactly.
that's a breakthrough.
Yes.
Because I
Yes,
really believe in
exactly.
creating safety and, you know, in the space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because we don't know that those protections might still be very valid. You know, we don't know what a person is dealing with.
All good points. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean, that's very important to underline here that you do see this kind of mentality, and it comes from I suppose the idea of the kind of crazy wisdom, you know, gurus, you know, and you know, many people can take on this mantra, right? That it's their place to kind of prod the particular kind of reactions that they might see in order to somehow provoke a response in the student whereby they might, you know, come to resolve that. But it's really, I mean, that's not only is it risky, it's really not, you know, it's really not one's place simply as a teacher of, you know, yoga asana, right? If anyone's place at all, right? Exactly. And as you say, because they also, you know, the trauma response, you know, and I think is also important to underscore this. It was a relevant response at the time and might still be relevant at that time, you know, might still have an important role because, you know, as you said, we have to get on, you know, every day, you know, like, and so, yeah, there's not a place necessarily for going into resolving these things if you need to function, hold down a job, support a family, do all the things that, you know, need you to have a certain sense of an even keel in, you know, in your daily life, right?
Yeah. And I think if it happens naturally through the practice in a safe, supportive place, like you said, with the, you know, especially with the Maestro style, where the person feels a lot of agency to move at their own pace. And if, you know, if some openings happen or some releases happen, it's done, I think, you know, in a safe container, hopefully. That's what I hope to teach teachers, is how to create a safer space.
First of all, maybe if we back up a second and say, well, how I didn't even realize, I think, that I even felt any or had any residual trauma in the body, right? And most people probably won't even recognize the fact that there's holding there. And, you know, as you pointed out at the start, to differing degrees, everyone has trauma in the body because, you know, living is traumatic, you know, like there's danger all the time and everyone goes through challenging experiences, right? So obviously that even many people obviously have gone through horrendous things of a particular nature, but many people just it may not be anything particular, just a general response to life and the difficulties and unsatisfactoriness of life in general that will be deeply traumatic to some people, right? But most of us, I think, go through life without even recognizing that we do have this holding, this tension, this residual kind of feeling in the body because it's so familiar. It's so familiar that it just seems like the norm, you know? So, I mean, and that was certainly the case for me. I felt completely fine as it was as a guy. You know, I'm fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah.
How might we kind of go into recognizing, you know, not to say that we're, you know, trying to, you know, kind of generate anything here, you know, that's not there, but how might we go to allowing for some the things to come out that might help us, you know, if they did, you know, recognize what the holding patterns are in the body.
Yeah, I think we get addicted to our stress, or it feels comfortable because it's what we're used to.
Yeah,
and feels
normal. Yeah.
And then when we are without it, we almost feel like we don't even know ourselves, right? So it can feel really
and it drives
strange.
you forward as well. Yeah.
And it can even, you know, it can feel strange to be happy if you're not even used to that, you know. It's really true. You know, we get some of us caught in just complaining or like, what would I, you know, we fall into our roles, whatever they are. And I think the practice of yoga, as it's, you know, I think you're suggesting it's done for you and it's done for me and so many of us, and particularly the Ashtanga practice, is really just slowly revealed layers of maybe other things of who we are as we let go of those stresses. I think we let go of even body patterns ways of reacting that are limiting. I think about just being open to like receiving communication, without already guessing, already knowing what the person's going to say. I think the practice kind of like releases a lot of that habitual stuff so that we can freely be present.
In your experience, was there any point you came to recognize certain kind of signs that you might then work with, as it were?
What you're looking for as for signs of trauma with the person?
Yeah, or within yourself, right? Yeah, because I mean, as you mentioned, I think you have the fight or flight, right? And that's a period of time, and it's usually an initial response, although it might still be a residual response, as a high alertness in, daily life. But after a while, I think that generally, in my own experience as well, comes into a freeze response where you then disassociate from the trauma and from the body. And then you kind of feel basically fairly numb, comfortably numb.
Yeah.
And so how do you get a little toehold in there in a way, a little finger hold into that, into sensation that might be there, but you've done a good job in covering it over and making sure you don't feel anything at all, but obviously that's not satisfactory either as a daily life, not feeling anything is kind of, it's kind of safe, but it's not really very satisfactory in a way of living,
Yeah.
So, what I'm suggesting here is how might we look for certain things to unpick this and get back into, the feelings that perhaps we do need to go into in order to resolve,
Yeah. I mean, I think something will like nag at us that we might be comfortable, but it might not be right, or we're missing out on something. So I think under that, like little voice will pop out, or, things are so together, but every once in a while there's like a weird outburst or something because like the truth wants to come out, So I think, or even in our dreams, right? So there's signs if something is suppressed, and it always like finds its way. Could be at a very strange time, I mean, and certainly being called to practice, somehow thinking it would be interesting to go and stretch your body. I mean, a lot of people, they say they come for weight loss. In the first place,
it suggests something.
But the fact that they enter, I think I think there's other things you can do for back pain or weight loss or whatever. So
you're right.
I think if someone's entering yoga room, maybe they know there's something that they have to work through.
Yeah. I mean, if you're coming and putting yourself into a system that's pretty demanding, often early in the morning, then and somewhere along the line, you're pretty hell bent on resolving something in your life, right? Because it does take a lot of effort and determination and courage. Like I have to say, on the record for anyone doing a self practice, not taking the ball into their own hands whatsoever with yoga to resolve something. Yeah, it's pretty courageous because you can easily just try and get by, as I did previous, just dumbing it down by distractions and self-medicating in different ways. So, anyone that enters into the yoga sphere or any, these kind of well-being spheres these days that are there for the resolution of trauma as we now know it, it's a pretty courageous step, and I think, deserves a pat on the back, for, before anything else, How might we practice then in order to allow a safe holding space? You mentioned before the role of the teacher or the way of practicing. Now, for many years, I feel that I'd practiced in a way that was so strenuous in a way, it was actually reaffirming a numbing pattern, that I'd managed to find a way of practicing that would actually kind of manage to keep everything at bay again. Although I said to myself that I was doing something which was cathartic and was for the sake of, going through, something that needs to be done. I practiced in such a kind of hard manner, I think, that I just managed to make myself feel nothing at all again because of the strenuousness of the activity. It just kind of wore me out, basically. So great, I didn't feel anything because I was just too tired to be, kind of emotional or anxious or, whatever, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I really see yoga, the practice, as a tool of self-discovery. And so always going into it with wanting to learn more about actually what's right for me and my makeup and my body and my temperament. And that's why the teacher is so important, especially in the Ashtanga practice, because and when it comes to trauma, the agency is so important, because that's what was stripped away. So the student really has to feel that it's like in their hands how much intensity they want to bring to the practice, what's right for them, their state, their body, and there's there are teachers that can say, oh, it's okay, you can like take it easy today, but you might not believe them. You might feel like they're gonna, if I do that 2 days in a row, or what if I need 2 months of like a more restful practice, like what's the conditioning around the room and then the other people in the room. So it really takes a lot of work to keep that power dynamic where the individual is really in charge and knows that any choice that they make is valid for them.
I think it's a really subtle line, because at the same time you want to be supported and feel that the teacher is also somewhat, I can't think of a better word to describe it right now, but somewhat directional. You don't want to teach us that, like, here's a space, just do whatever you want. I mean, if I'd come into that kind of space, as someone who, was already suffering a lot of doubt, indecision, uncertainty in life, I would think, well, what the hell is this? I want a strong teacher there as well to tell me how, and advise me how to practice. But as you say as well, at the same time, especially nowadays, it wasn't the same, well, perhaps when we started, this emphasis on individual agency, I think, has become important, kind of increasingly popular as a discourse, because it is important as well. Maybe we tipped previously into a too directional and too authoritarian approach as teachers, as student. And now I also see it's possible we could tip the other way, and the student has, is really just there doing whatever they want, and the teacher, just kind of, which doesn't feel supportive either in a way. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think going back to like knowing what's expected of me, like what I'm supposed to do in this space, having some direction can actually make me feel calmer, right? And more secure, like feeling like, that structure is really important, especially as far as trauma. But I think, and I hear what you're saying, and I agree to an extent, but I just also want to throw out there that, there's a thing with teachers where they see the student doing something different or not what they want them to do. And like, we kind of have to check our ego on it. Like, is it like, am I annoyed because the student is like pushing my buttons of like what I think that they should do because they're a student and I told them to do that. And there's just like all those things to check, because we're in a powerful.
Well, I guess this is kind of ranging into the topic of how to kind of relate to trauma in the yoga room more generally, right? In how you give an instruction and how you suggest a cue, and how, whether it's whether it's a suggestion, whether there are different options given as possibilities, how dictatorial it is, how much expectation is there. Because obviously, I mean, the one thing that we want to allow in this special situation, which and I do think it, although I don't want to wax lyrical, I never have about the Ashtanga practice, I think that is very unique. This autonomy of self-practice yoga is a very unique thing, and the opportunity of being in the room. And I've always said to my students, this is a time when you can be however you want to be. There's no expectation on you being a certain way here, you know, and but within that, but within that structure, obviously there is somewhat that, you know, that the student can't be completely chaotic, and you know, and disrespects other people in there as well, you know. So again, there's always two sides to it, and it is a fine line to tread, I think, between
I mean,
what I wanted to do, which was
in a group class, a group yoga class or group exercise class or any kind of group, you know, group therapy, there have to be some rules of the space that everyone can agree to, so that all the people in the space can be safe, right? Because if like I need to move around frantically to feel safe, but you need everyone like still around you to feel safe, like how are we going to reconcile that, right? So yeah, it can't be like total chaos. That's absolutely true. But I think there can be very subtle things, especially within the Mysore practice or the Ashtanga practice, that are really, really helpful and wonderful, you know, as far as like trauma, like the tristana, right? The fact that we don't look at each other, you know, or look at a mirror, but the eyes are, you know, focused on the one point, is just an instance of structure that actually is very helpful, right? Because I might not feel comfortable around other people, but I know that they are not supposed to look at me. Also, you know, just the way I think about the tristana as far as like with trauma survivors is, instead of holding attention around all three, if that's too intense, one can kind of move their attention. Like, I'm just going to focus on looking at this point and not really pay so close attention to my breath right now. Because sometimes intense focus on breath can be triggering. Maybe it's there in the background, but I can work within the tristana of like, I'm going to give 30% here, 80% here. And that's just like a subtle thing that we can do in the practice that can help move through what might be a kind of activating or triggering moment. Yeah.
I think along those lines, I feel like the yoga can then, you know, if it can, I feel, be used as a practice to keep the lid on things, you know, and many people have told me similarly that you can practice so strenuously that you could actually kind of re-numb yourself. But also, if you're doing it reasonably, more efficiently than I was for a long time, I think inherently it's meant to dredge up these things and bring, you know, kind of stir up the sediment that's kind of compacted and kind of, you know, like rigid in the body, and stir up these things back into the present. The emotional reactions, people often talk about backbends, stirring up strong emotional responses. And what do we do though when these responses come up? I mean, you know, otherwise yoga is potentially more, you know, does in some respects more harm than it does good, right? I mean, how do we kind of maintain a kind of structure around the practice so the whole thing doesn't become overwhelming?
Yeah. And I think like that oscillating, or what they call like pendulation. So moving into the intense feeling, you know how you can put your attention in it, and where we bring our attention, it grows, and then moving your attention away from it when it's too much, and then coming back to it. So kind of like letting the steam out slowly of releasing the trauma, as instead of like blowing the whole lid off the pot, which sometimes can result in, you know, you can snap. So you don't actually release, but you re-traumatize. So it's not about just being comfortable all the time, but we don't have to like take our nervous system again to re-traumatize. I think moving in and out of those extremes and moving our attention can help to like let the release be a little more subtle.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a reason why we're not going into the traumas in the first place, because we feel that they're overwhelming and that something, you know, and that will break if they do come up, that we won't be able to cope. And as you say, that the possibility there is to lay further trauma over the original trauma and kind of compact the whole thing in a sense. So I think that's really, really a good and practical information to have, that, to to try and somehow modulate the intensity with a period of rest or just kind of decompression, as it were. But else, I mean, you're doing this practice for, you know, an hour or so a day, and then you go out and you're stepping on the street again, and, you know, you may be open or maybe feeling these things, you know, and, you know, if you're in New York, I was in London for many years, you're coming out of an open space into chaos of a big, huge modern city, you know. I mean, is there anything you could suggest in a way that, you know, you could kind of integrate this experience into daily life and help to give oneself the support to process things?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's, in my opinion, very, very important to make sure that you're closing your practice in a way that's regulating. I mean, we have this great closing, nice long closing sequence that I think lots of people skip and shorten and rush on. And especially, you know, folks dealing with trauma are going to have trouble laying in a shavasana or taking long stillness. You know, and that's something where we might want to be really sensitive as a teacher or practitioner, like, you know, allowing to lay on the side or be, you know, in a place in the room where we have access to an exit, or we can sit and take rest if laying down is too triggering. But making sure that there's some kind of closing where the body's, you know, regulating itself again. And like I said, I like that about the Ashtanga practice, as opposed to like some other practices where they're really leaving you maybe feeling great. You know, I mean, Bikram comes to mind. I'll just say it. You know, you're like, I've done it, and you leave really high, you know, because your nervous system is all activated. You know, it's kind of like a second series, kind of like, you're like, and the student, like, you think you feel great. And then of course the teacher gets that feedback that like, I'm doing something great and everyone feels great, but is it like not really? It's kind of like a jittery. So sometimes, you know, things that feel great aren't great for us. And sometimes we feel really crappy after practice and that might be good for us. So it's complicated, right? But taking that time to close properly is really, really important. Simple thing, drinking a glass of water is really grounding, really, really grounding. So taking like a glass of water after practice can help get back out there.
As a teacher, do you talk at all to students about other lifestyle aspects to, you know, to kind of navigate or integrate the practice within a greater whole? Because I remember we're obviously doing this thing for such a short time in the day, but, you know, the idea is to have it as an overriding attitude towards one's life, the idea of yoga, right? As we're always hearing these days, yoga isn't just asana, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you've probably experienced and seen, folks come in maybe for the asana and then they start to ask other questions. They want your advice on all sorts of things. They start making, you know, life changes, dietary, everything changes. I mean, if you have to get up that early, you know, sleep changes. I remember when I first started practicing, I was so tired. You know, I would go into such a deep restorative sleep. So a lot of things, I want to say, kind of work themselves out because of the practice. Like your sleep cycles can get better, your digestion gets better, and that's when all of that's working better, our mental and emotional states are better. So the actual functioning of our physical body impacts our emotional state. You know, when our digestion is not good, we don't feel good mentally. So, you know, those type of things, I think happen kind of naturally. I mean, and a student comes to me for deeper support. Of course, I mean, I can offer that as I have other certifications as far as somatic experience and life coaching, working on a master's in mental health, clinical mental health therapy. But I think it's important for teachers not to, you know, offer therapy if they're not, you know, licensed therapists, and that we should really get better about referring out you know, and being
Yeah.
like really honest and really humble with that. Like, you know, we can't do everything and we're not everything, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And having, but perhaps I always suggest having your own processes as well that you're still doing, whether, training yoga with another teacher or going to some other therapy or engaging in modalities, so you can kind of remain in the loop and have other connections, and also have other connections, in your belt, as it were, that you can say, or you could kind of try this, or like go and see that person, because people will inevitably come up to you, and they will ask these questions, and you want to be of help, and you don't want to say, oh, I don't have a clue, But then I think that often leads people to then kind of say things that they don't really, or go into territory they don't really understand, just because they want to, in the best will of the world, want to be helpful. Which kind of leads me to thinking, it's a grey territory between leaving people on their own and giving people that, kind of utter autonomy to having some relationship with a student whereby they feel somewhat supported and known and acknowledged, in a deeper way than just as a body, and I think it's tricky, isn't it? Because, people, maybe they want that sense of anonymity, with you as a teacher. Other students really that they will feel like they want to be recognized on a deeper level. And have you got anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I always love the students, of course, that come and talk about their lives or like want your advice, or just feel so close to you, they feel that like this incredible closeness, and it's very powerful. It can also be very, dangerous and compromising. So I think, I mean, I don't think of leaving them, like, I don't do that, like, but I do think it's important to have some, boundaries around, what you can and cannot advise on, because, frankly, it can hurt everyone in the end, right? If we give even if we give a good advice, I mean, it is best to maybe ask some questions. Try to ask questions more than give answers. That's what I would say. Try to offer more questions, more places to explore. Like, oh, I'm hearing this. Like, maybe you want to try this or read this book, and offer them like just more resources. I think that's the best thing that we can do, is offer resources. And like you said, like, take other people's courses and classes and learn other modalities, so you know what you're talking about, and don't be afraid to lose your student, or let them out into the world,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we see it, especially endemically in Ashtanga, this wish to kind of keep your students, and and not refer them outwards where they might go someplace else, right? And I think that's a shame, because, everyone has their time and place with the person, right? And it's a journey which usually involves more than just one person and one modality, You mentioned before about the idea of triggering, and people being triggered, and this is obviously a buzzword these days. It's being thrown around here, there, and everywhere, right? How much of the responsibility lies in the teacher for this, and what might we try and look to and avoid, and how much must we say? I mean, I remember Bessa van der Kolk saying, and if he's saying it, I kind of felt, well, we have to listen to this. And he says, look, listen, you can't wrap people up in cotton wool. He said the world, is triggering. And it's not helpful to wrap people up in cotton wool, and so that they never potentially get upset by. I mean, we used to call it being upset by, upset by any of your your statements or ideas. So I think maybe something you might say about that would be very interesting to hear.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can never promise a perfectly safe space. Because like I said earlier, you have no idea what can trigger someone. And I'm talking about really trigger, I'm not talking about just being uncomfortable. I mean, someone can have a flashback, based on, or a panic attack, you know, based on on something you never would have picked up, you know, or noticed. So it's impossible to promise that your space is perfectly safe. And I think we have a responsibility to learn as much as we can about, you know, what creates a safer space for people, and especially in relation to cultures or, types of people that we might not know about or be around, to really listen to them. Like, you know, if I'm straight, I want to learn about folks who are in the gay community, to, you know, understand those triggers might be different, and I might not be aware of them because I'm not in that community. Yeah. So I think, you know, we have to be careful about the pendulum has shifted where it's like, don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And probably many of us have a lot of work to do around understanding folks who aren't like us, you know, who come from different backgrounds than we do. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I think we can make as teachers is assuming that everyone feels, and as people, everyone experiences life or feels things the same way we do, you know?
Yeah. It is tricky because I think as a teacher in the current climate, you can really feel like you almost don't want to show your personality at all, or you know, you're so kind of tentative that you end up kind of not really being yourself, you know, because you don't want to say anything that might, again, like, you know, rightfully so, that, you know, you don't want to upset anyone by possibly saying something. And, you know, to be honest, I've had a couple of occasions where I've said things to, you know, long-term students and who have suffered from trauma, and they've come back and said, well, that particular cue, that, you know, that's up, you know, it wasn't weird or anything, you know, but that's made me feel uncomfortable because of this or that reason, you know, often suffering through body feelings of dysmorphia, or, you know, difficulties with food and eating, etc. So, you know, the way you phrase things,
how we react. Well, how you brought up it's such an important point, and I'm really glad you brought this in, and that you shared your experience. And that's going to happen, you know, we're gonna make mistakes, you know, where we are going to do that because we do have just our limited life experience. And no matter how much we read about other people and learn, we're still going to have blind spots, and not even really supposed to say blind spots, right? So like, there's like so much of like, you know, we're going to make mistakes. And the thing is, what do we do? Right? It's like taking responsibility and believing a person, right? When they tell you that they were hurt.
Yeah, first and foremost, that is the fact for them, even if it doesn't feel that way, even if you think, well, I said that and I didn't mean that at all. It doesn't matter. They had that feeling, so it's relevant. But, you know, having said all that, you know, I feel, having been someone who has suffered, you know, high anxiety states in my early 20s when starting yoga, I feel there was probably a number of times I could call up that I was triggered in a classroom situation. And at that time, obviously, there was no talk about this, and you just kind of took it on the chin. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think there's still something also to be said for the fact that we can't defer a whole experience to be safeguarded by another, because that isn't really taking personal autonomy either. It doesn't feel safe either, right? You know, like, taking ownership for one's own feelings is definitely also part of it, you know?
Yeah. And we also don't know how many people left, you know, without sharing their, like, some of us took it, you know, and then how many people had, I know a lot of people had a bad yoga experience and never went back to a practice that could have maybe really been great for them, right? And that's always like so sad to me when I hear that.
It's a real shame. Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's the real catastrophe of so many unfortunate, heavy-handed Ashtanga teachers specifically, well, we find it in, I'm sure we could say the same of Bikram or any other style really, but we know Ashtanga, so we see it in this world and we hear stories in this world, so, and yes, that is, is so often the case. And so it's really important, the work of people like you coming up and and giving voice to this issue that, people are sensitive when they come in the room. You're doing something which is opening, which is bearing yourself. And at this point, especially, one has to be very, very sensitive into the way that you phrase things. I mean, are there any examples you can give of better and worse phraseology, for example? Because that's the main thing that we're talking about, really. We're mainly talking about, the 90% of the instructions we're giving, and I'm going to come onto this in a second, the adjustments, which is there'll be the final cherry on the cake. How do we touch people sensitively? You were waiting for that one, right? But in the before that, it's like, well, how do we cue sensitively? Our voice is probably the 90% of what we use here.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I really don't like is when a teacher tells you, like, this is going to feel this way or should feel this way, or trying, like, we don't get this as much in Ashtanga, but I used to get this a lot in Vinyasa styles, like things like relationship stuff lies deep in your hips, and as you do this pose, and so or like, this is a relaxing pose, just where either they're kind of like, you might have the experience because you're in a kind of a state where you're easily like subjective, or you don't have the experience that the teacher says you're supposed to have, and then you're like, what's wrong with me? Is something wrong with me? I should be feeling this.
What's wrong with me? Yeah. This should be relaxed, but I'm not relaxed. Yeah, and that would definitely trigger me. That kind of thing, Yeah, everyone's feeling relaxed. This is a relaxing pose. The teacher said it. Everyone appears to be relaxed, and yet I feel really panicky. And yeah, that would really, really get me. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Not legislating on people's experience as well, right? But also it's around, like, what about the idea of these days we don't say modifications, for example, right? That would suggest a sense of lack on the student, right? We used to say, if you can't do this, do this, but yeah. So how do you phrase that? Yeah, you build up. Yeah.
I try to build up. I try to like start with the maybe most modified version, and then say, and if you're feeling like you want a little bit more of a challenge, or if you're wanting a little more heat or intensity, then you can do this, So it's more of a building up instead of like toppling down kind of feeling. So if you do more, you're like, okay, yeah.
I was going to say, how do you, within this discourse, how do you build challenge into it? Because it's easy to go the other way with the trauma discourse, that everything becomes about safety, about comfort. And, and as we know, like, we can't deny yoga is about transformation. It's about being challenged. It's about facing pain, and resolving pain because you faced it. But, obviously that's not our personal place as a teacher to guide people into that area and make them face these things or make them transform. But on the other hand, you don't want to be the person who's making sure that never happens either. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I don't think that intense poses necessarily mean you're going to have an intense emotional reaction. Like we were saying earlier, like sometimes the quietest, most still, laying quietly at the end. So it doesn't mean that a survivor is not going to want to do a challenging asana. And so that's something we should also think about, is like not being like so delicate that, I'm not going to give that person this asana because, they've experienced a trauma. It's just, kind of showing the options that are there, a few clear options that a person can then say, yeah, I want to do a little more. Show me the next way to express this pose that is maybe a little more physically challenging. And as you said, that can, that can sometimes, we can physically challenge ourselves because we want to push stuff away. So it's, you know.
Oh yeah, I know. I think that's a bizarre thing that kind of came to me kind of way long down the track, you know, that actually what I was doing dynamically on a physical level was covering over the possibility of going into any kind of subtler realm of experiencing myself, because it was just so demanding on a physical level. It allowed me to cover over anything else, which is a revelation at the time. It kind of seems normal, an obvious idea now when I say it, but at the time I was like, oh, that's what I've been doing, you know. So, as I promised, we have to now talk about the role of assistance, what we used to call it adjustments, in in this current climate of trauma, and being more aware of that, and how we might frame. You know, do we keep with the adjustments? I mean, what's your view on them these days? You know, the physical assistance.
Um, I don't. My view is there's not one right answer for everyone. There's definitely a question of, there's a lot of questions around like how much consent can be in a space where there is a dynamic of a teacher who's leading, you know? So, yeah, like, you know, if I feel, going back to that kind of earlier part of the conversation where it's like, I feel that you want me to do something.
How much consent, you said?
Yeah.
Yes, was like a forced confession, isn't it? It's like, well, you know, like, yes, oh, it's okay, because it's not really okay, but it's like, well, how much choice do you have? Do you know what I mean? Even if the teacher comes up and says, can I, you know, it's like, well, you're going to say no, like, especially as someone who might, you know, be feeling vulnerable anyway, you know, you're not going to be the one that sticks out and says, oh yeah, no thanks. You know, I mean, how possible is that?
Yeah. So it gets really, really tricky, you know, in the spaces where, so I run a nonprofit and we train teachers in in trauma sensitivity when teaching yoga, and we actually place them in shelters and food banks, in domestic survivor spaces, in spaces where people are actively using or in recovery. And in those spaces, which are, you know, really specifically trauma survivor spaces, we just say no touch across the board. So in that, I can say, you know, in that circumstance.
Sensible. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, going back to that, what was a very formative podcast with Bessa van der Kolk, when I was suggesting different possibilities around physical touch, and he was saying, I mean, he's absolutely adamant that it was imperative. If you don't touch the people, he said, they will never learn what safe touch is. They will never resolve these experiences if they don't have bodily touch, which I thought was interesting, because at the time, I suppose, you know, due to speaking to someone like Bessel, I was kind of treading the other line, you know, about being, you know, very cautious, and, you know, it's like, but, you know, so it's interesting to hear him say that, you know, without touch, you know, that it's a hopeless situation. He was really very, very pro the necessity of touch, which
touch is very, very healing, and in the right, you know, the right circumstance, the right setup, you know, of course, touch is very important and very, very healing.
And as you said, there's no one answer to how to phrase that to someone. I mean, I guess there's a lot of signs and symbols to interpret, and they're not all just simply, can I touch you, yes or no. I mean, there's so much else going on when we're in presence with someone else, you know, and to learning to pick up more deeply than simply, you know, not reading anything and then stepping up to the person, just simply asking them what is a very loaded question, really, you know?
Yeah. How about just like, can I be next to you? And you're like, what would support you in this moment in your practice? You know, there's a lot of questions that we can ask that can build, you know, trust.
Yeah. And I think that's a really big part of it that's not really acknowledged in this dialogue of assistance much, is the fact that, well, probably if someone walks off the street, you know, you wouldn't walk up to them and hug them. But yet, if they walk into a yoga class, the precedent has been, you know, at least historically, has been that you would just give, you know, very intimate assistance to someone that you certainly wouldn't even fist pump them in the street, as it were. So, you know what I mean? It's a bizarre circumstance. And I think that, so my understanding of it is that the touch builds up over time from a very, very formal and, hands off, kind of the lightest of assistance to over a relationship over time where there's trust built up, and then the physical assistance can deepen, So it's a staggered kind of affair where a relationship is built,
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it depends on each individual student and how we feel. When they say like some people are more sensitive than others, that's actually a real thing. Some people are more sensitive, like actually feel things more intensely. So that's something that's really different between humans, which is very interesting when you start to study that, and that will blow your mind, right? Like, and we know there are people that have sensory experience where it's very, very overwhelming.
And also the fact that every day and every person is a unique experience and a unique kind of circumstance, right? Just because something happened with that person, you did, one day, doesn't mean they're going to be the same the next day,
So important. Great point. Very important point. So we can't assume like it's okay today.
But yeah, I think that's the main assumption here is that not that the problem with the trauma is making assumptions, and being presentness, being ultimately present with someone will avoid so much difficulty, I think, along these lines, right? If you're actually aware enough and interested enough to pick up the signs, and what's going on,
Yeah, I think that's it. And then that's kind of goes back to what we were saying about, if you're doing your practice in the right way with the right intention, which, not all teachers are. Some are like that ego building and that just kind of performance and everything. But if you really are doing that inner work with your practice to like clear yourself of that and to really show up in that very open to learning, like as the teacher, open to learning and being, that's what presence is, right? Being really curious and open in that moment to being surprised, right? Anything could happen in any moment. It's like that, in that the space that I think we can be very healing and helpful, and also avoid kind of the mistakes. Yeah.
I mean, also just want to add as we close that the value of the teacher is incredible, even though they don't need to be actively doing something or answering your questions or resolving your trauma. The value of just simply being heard, right? I mean, someone like Carl Rogers, the fantastic psychologist of the 1960s, would say that, radical empathy, just the fact of actually someone you feel has actually heard you, because we listen, but so little of the time you actually feel someone's really there, acknowledging you. And I mean, I think that's incredibly valuable, and it's an incredible tool of the teachers. And I think that that's underestimated, and the teacher feels that that's not enough. So therefore I have to do, whereas that I think is a lot.
It's so much. The studies show that a person just believing that someone would listen to them and believe if they talk, like just thinking that there's someone out there that would is even enough. So, I mean, the role of the teacher is incredible, and it's hard for us to realize in our egos and in our stuff that it's our peeling back our own layers and often doing less that does more. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful chat with you today, and I appreciate the time you've given. And if you want any more information on this, you can find the links below the podcast to Lara and what she's doing, what she's working on, and the current, the book that is coming out soon. What's the title of the book again?
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, The Essential Guide to Trauma-Sensitive Yoga.
Right. So that's coming out I think in the new year, sometime early spring. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you again, Lara, for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you.